everybody, here's part 21 of Seaman. Another warm day, huh? Louis chuckled at his own jokes, closed his ink bottle, and skipped out the door of the captain's sleep hut with Seaman romping beside him. Clark, his eyes on his paper, but the corners of his mouth curled into a little smile. On this gloomy day, he didn't catch himself feeling a bit homesick. He did catch himself feeling a bit homesick. And when his thoughts wandered towards the United States, he found himself picturing the young lady he had hoped to marry. The Clatsop Indians often came to the fort, and their explorers joined them nearby Indian village. The Clatsop lived in wooden houses divided into rooms for related families. When Seaman went with the men to the Indian village, he was welcome in the Indians' dim, smoky houses. The houses smelled like fish because the Clatsops ate mostly fish rather than meat. Large decorated baskets filled with roots and seeds lined the walls of their houses. The likable, easygoing Indian braves invited the explorers to play games, gamble, and smoke with them. Seaman dozed beside the men and retrieved sticks thrown by the Indian children. One day, the Indians brought news to the fort. A whale had washed ashore. The captains decided to send a group to the coast to see the creature and bring back some meat. Captain Clark wanted to lead the group. Sacagawea asked if she could come along for the trip. Her face fell when Clark said no. "Janie," he explained, "you and little Pomp will be safer here. We're going to take a canoe over to the coast, and a storm might blow up to sea. Your baby is only 11 months old. He could slip off your back in the rough waters. And remember how strong the waves from the Point Ellis were? Remember how seasick you got on those waves?" Sacagawea stood silently looking at Clark. Seaman brushed against her leg, and she ignored him. Puzzled, Seaman sat and watched the Indian woman's face, and his ears cocked. "Besides," Louis continued, "we'll want big, strong men to butcher the whale carcass and haul the meat back to camp." "I think it's very hard to refuse me," Sacagawea said. "I have traveled a long way to see great waters as far as any of the men, and I have done my share of work. Now there is a monstrous fish to be seen, and I wish very much to see it." The captain's eyes met. This was the first time the Indian woman had been insistent about anything. She had traveled as far and worked as hard as any of them, perhaps more so because she carried her child on her back. It did seem mean to deny her request. And then here's a picture. Sometimes how there's pictures. And it looks like that's the whale carcass. Found only the skeleton of this monster on the sand where the waves and tides had driven up and left it. This skeleton measured 105 feet. Journal of Captain William Clark, January 8th, 1806. Louis nodded at Clark, then he spoke. "Janie and the baby have been on the canoe when we rode through some of the very rough rapids. She's been level-headed in plenty of risky situations. I think she and Pomp will be safe on the sea coast," Louis said. "This will probably be her only chance to see the Pacific Ocean." Louis added, "You can take Seaman along with you. He'll keep an eye on Pomp if the waves swamp the boat. As a matter of fact, Seaman would probably enjoy a romp in the ocean. He got his name because he was meant to go to sea, and he hasn't been to the actual sea coast yet." Clark agreed, and the party set off. They found the whale on the sandy beach near this creek on Tillamook Head on January 8th. By the time they got there, the whale's blubber had already been removed by Indians, but the huge skeleton lying on the sand was still an impressive sight. "Look at these creatures," Clark exclaimed. "It's bigger than a house." Seaman ran around the carcass, growling at the strange odor. He sniffed the whale's mouth and tugged at the chunks of sandy skin. Then he rolled in the wet sand, covering his own scent with the odor of the dead sea life. Captain Clark paced out the length of the skeleton and declared it was 105 feet long. The explorers walked around the carcass amazed. They measured the thickness of the whale's bones by comparing them with the size of their hands. They knelt in the sand and brushed off the big tail to admire it. Seaman wiggled inside the whale's ribs and barked playfully at the men. Pomp watched the dog from his clean, dry perch on Sacagawea's back. He laughed aloud when Seaman tunneled out the skeleton and dashed past, flinging wet sand behind him. The men visited local Indians to barter for blubber and whale oil. Sacagawea walked along the shore with Seaman. From the beach, the gray cloud sky seemed endless. Out in the deeper water, large waves rolled and crashed. Yet when the same waves neared the shore, they grubbed softly at the wet sand under Sacagawea's bare feet. She stood facing the open ocean, thinking about the large world. She wondered if she was the first Shoshone woman who had stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Seaman splashed in the shallow water and pawed at the crabs tumbling in the waves. Sacagawea smiled and slipped Pomp off her back. She held the baby at the edge of the water. He kicked his feet, squealing at the cold moving water. Seaman dashed over, kicking a spray of water into the air, and nuzzled Pomp's face. The big dog turned and leaped in the waves to grab a long ribbon of seaweed. He shook his head, waving the kelp in the air. Pomp laughed. Seaman turned and ran back to Pomp, dragging the seaweed. When the slimy kelp brushed against Pomp's head, he gasped and started to cry. Sacagawea giggled and playfully splashed Seaman. Seaman dropped the seaweed and ran in big circles around Sacagawea and Pomp, spraying water all over them. Clark called to them. Sacagawea put Pomp back in his cradle board and joined the group. The men had brought about 300 pounds of blubber and oil to take back to Fort Clatsop. Clark cut off a chunk of the pink-white blubber and offered it to Seaman. He wagged his tail, drooling, and swallowed the whole piece in one gulp. Clark was very pleased with their whale of an adventure. In his journal he wrote, "Thank Providence for directing the whale to us, and thank him much more kind to us than he was to Jonah, having sent this monster to be swallowed by us instead of swallowing us as Jonah did." That's like a Bible story. The explorers were delighted to have a new food to vary their daily diet. They thought the blubber was very tender, with a slight sweet taste. Shannon declared it was better than dog meat. York said the blubber tasted even better than beaver. By March, the explorers were restless to be moving again. They hoped the winter snow and the ice along their inland route had begun to melt so their travel would be easy. The men knew they would have to haul their canoes up the Columbia Rapids, and they had to reach the Rocky Mountains before their short summer in high country was over. Once past these obstacles, they would be in the rich Beaver and Buffalo County of the Plains. Then they would be nearing St. Louis and home. The captains were disappointed that they had not made contact with a seagoing vessel at the coast. That meant the Corps of Discovery would start home in a state of poverty, with only a handful of trade goods. But staying longer at Fort Clatsop would not help their situation, since local Indians refused to lower their prices even though the expedition had almost nothing left to trade. During their last season of travel, the explorers had deposited several caches of supplies along the route. If those caches had not been raided, the captain hoped to pick up supplies and trade goods as they traveled. As the men packed for their trip home, their excitement grew. They gathered their rifles and ammunition, kettles and tools, scientific instruments and journals. Seaman ran back and forth from the fort to the river, his saddlebag stuffed with gear. "Hey, Seaman," called York as they walked up to the fort to get another load. He held out a sturdy stick for a game of tug of war. "Let's see who's stronger, the mighty York or the great Newfoundland." Seaman grabbed the stick and shook his head from side to side. In less than a minute, the Newfoundland was holding the stick in his mouth, and York was pulling splinters out of his palm. John Coulter smirked as he walked by with a large box of supplies in his arms. "The mighty York is strong, all right." "Ah, that old stick was rotten," York muttered. "It fell apart in my hand." York pulled out splinters. "Everything gets rotten in this soppy weather." Coulter called over his shoulder, "The faster we get packed, the faster we get out of this soppy weather." George Shannon jogged up from the river and called Seaman. "We're headed home, boy," he said, grinning. "Home to the biscuits and corn and bread and apple pie." Seaman barked and raced beside Shannon towards the fort. "This time of year I'm going to be watching the trees bud in the Kentucky sunshine," Shannon announced. The captain said farewell to the chief and the neighbors in Clatsop and declared the Fort Clatsop, including its rough furniture, belonged to his people now. The captains also tried to bargain for another Indian canoe, but they could not afford the price the Clatsops were asking. Frustrated and eager to get moving, the captains ordered the men to steal a canoe. It was the first time during the whole journey the captains had allowed the Corps to steal from Indians. The men pushed off their canoes just after midday on March 23rd. At last, the Corps of Discovery was headed home. Chapter 13. I'm going to start to read this because we really only have 6 days more of reading. And it says I have an hour more left of this book on my Kindle. So, heading home, late March through July. Seaman splashed into the Columbia River and swam hard. Moving upstream against the strong current was exhausting. When he reached the bank, he hopped out and shook the chilly water off his coat. Coulter called to him from the canoes. "Here, Seaman, come ride with us." Seaman leaped into the water and caught up with the canoe that Coulter was in. "Riding these rapids was a lot more fun last fall, wasn't it?" Coulter said as he helped the dog scramble aboard. All the explorers remembered the thrill of riding the rapids to the coast. Now the men encountered the same rapids, but this time the river was throwing its power against them. They paddled and pulled against the swift current. Sometimes they tied ropes to the canoes and hauled them up the rushing waters. Other times they had to portage. The explorers began their homeward journey in the early spring. Food supplies were running low, and the salmon hadn't begun their spring run yet. Game animals were skinny and hard to find. When they left behind the coastal climate, the explorers saw a countryside awaken from its winter snowy grip. Tiny buds sprouted from the tips of trees. Pale green shoots pushed through the damp soil. The Indians in the Chinook village were as lean as the game. As the explorers struggled against the Columbia current, the Chinooks surrounded them. They visited the explorers' camps at night. The explorers were glad to trade with the villagers for meat and roots, but the villagers charged high prices for their food. When the explorers had traveled past these same Chinook villages on their way to the coast, they had resented the high prices the Indians had charged. Now that food was scarce, the Indian prices were even higher. The explorers recalled something else about the Chinooks. These Indians had stolen from them. Since the explorers were traveling more slowly now, moving upstream, the Indians had more chances to steal. They took the expedition's iron tools, spoons, food, and even clothing. The thefts became a major issue. On April 8th, Seaman's barking alerted the guards to a stranger sneaking into camp. The guards threatened the thief with his gun. When the Indians wouldn't leave, the guard whipped him with a switch. Although the captain urged the men to control their tempers, they shared the men's frustration. "These Chinook are constantly hanging about us," Lewis complained one evening. "As soon as we turn our backs, they steal anything they can grab. If anybody ever tried to steal from me like this in the United States, I'd give him a beating he wouldn't forget." The rascal would think twice the next time his fingers got sticky. The thieves waited for moments when the explorers were busy. So the captain posted guards to watch the baggage while the men carried the canoes over waterfalls. Seamen stood guard alongside the men. Sometimes the Chinooks would pester the guards by throwing stones at them. Seaman ran up the bank barking at the stone throwers, but the guards called him back. They needed to keep every eye on the baggage in this country of thieves. On the evening of April 11th, Seaman was running through the woods near camp when 3 Chinook Indians called him and held out a chunk of dried salmon. Uh-oh. Seaman bounded over and sat down, his tail wagging eagerly. The Indians gave him some fish and stroked his fur, and they began walking briskly towards the trees. As they walked, they broke off little pieces of dried fish and fed them to Seaman. When they were a few hundred yards away from camp, the Indians stopped. One leaned over and stroked the dog's head. Suddenly, another Indian wrapped a piece of rope around Seaman like a muzzle and pulled it tight so the dog could not bark or bite. At the same time, the 3rd Chinook threw a long rope around Seaman's neck. As soon as Seaman was tied up, the thieves hurried through the woods, pulling the dog behind them. Seaman jerked his head from side to side to free himself, but the Indians yanked hard on the rope, choking him. When Seaman stiffened his legs and refused to walk, the Indians dragged him. The harder Seaman struggled, the tighter the rope around his neck became. Seaman was terrified. Although he had been around people all his life, he had never been handled so cruelly. An Indian trader was leaving the explorers' camp and saw the ambush. He ran back to camp with the news. Lewis exploded. He immediately sent Coulter and 2 other men after the thieves. If they don't surrender Seaman at once, fire on them, he ordered. This is the last straw. I bet those thieves plan to butcher Seaman for meat. And we're going to stop there. Have a great weekend, everybody. I will see you Monday, our very last week of school, and we will tie a bow around this terrific novel, Seaman, the dog who traveled with Lewis and Clark.